We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 51a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the Mishnah, which said that the buyer has a certain amount of time to investigate whether he overpaid, and once that time passes, he can no longer go back on the conditions of the sale. And Rav Nachman said that that applies specifically to the buyer because the buyer has the object, so he has the ability to find someone, show someone the object, and see if he overpaid. However, when it comes to the seller does not have the object, and so therefore he has forever. If he finds out much later on even that he ended up selling it for too little amount of money, he's allowed to go back on the conditions of the sale. And the Gemara is now in the middle of bringing a proof from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that when the sellers found out that Rabbi Tarfon extended the amount of time for the buyer, meaning now that the buyer has a whole day, so then they retracted, so to speak, and they said, we prefer the position of the Chachamim. And so the Gemara said, if the seller has forever, then it makes sense. Mishum hachi chazru, that's why they wanted to go back to the opinion of the Rabbanan. They didn't like Rabbi Tarfon's opinion. As Rashi explains, Mishum hachi chazru, shehem hayu mochron, because they were sellers. Ve'ino nenin behar chavasman, they gained nothing with the extended amount of time that Rabbi Tarfon gave. Ve'ein nenin behar chavasman hachazar de Rabbi Tarfon shari afilu Rabbanan liolam chozrim, because again, they had forever. It didn't affect them at all in any positive way. It was only a negative for them. But if you're going to say the seller is identical to the buyer, so what difference does it make that Rabbi Tarfon gave the buyer a little extra time? Then they also have a little extra time. Just like the Rabbanan are doing something on behalf of the buyer, so too, the Rabbanan are doing the same thing on behalf of the mocher. So it doesn't really make sense that when Rabbi Tarfon said that the buyers have more time, that the sellers would have protested. And the Gemara answers to that, Tagari Lud lo shchiach dato, the merchants of Lud, it was not common that they would make a mistake in terms of selling, that they would sell something for too low of a price. And so therefore, when Rabbi Tarfon extended the amount of time, the fact that they got the extension as well wasn't much of a benefit for them because they generally didn't make a mistake. It was actually just to their detriment because now the buyer had more time. That's why they wanted to go back to the position of the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues, Ushbezichne de Rami Bar Chama, the landlord of Rami Bar Chama, Zovin Chamra V'tah, he sold wine, he made a mistake. He sold it for too low of a price. Ashkechei de Haviyotzev, Rami Bar Chama found that the landlord was sad. Amar Lei said to him, Amay Atzift, why are you sad? Amar Lei said to him, Zvini Chamra V'tah, he said, I sold wine, I made a mistake. Amar Lei said to him, Zil Haderbach, so why don't you just go retract the sale? Amar Lei said to him, Hashoy li yoser michdei she'er letagor lekrov, he said, I've waited longer than the amount of time to show a merchant or my relative, and that's why I've essentially the time has passed. I can't go back. Shadrei lekami de Rav Nachman, so he sent him in front of Rav Nachman. Amar Lei said to him, Lo shanu elo lokeach, the idea of having that specific amount of time, that's just on the buyer's side. Avol mocher liolam chozer, but the seller, he always has the opportunity to go back on the sale. My time, and what's the reason? Why do we make this distinction? Lokeach mekcho biyadu, because the lokeach, he has the object that he bought in his hand. Everywhere he goes, he can show it. And they can tell him whether he made a mistake or not. But the mocher who doesn't have the object that was sold in his possession, so he has to wait till he finds something similar to what he sold, and then he'll be able to know if he made a mistake or if he did not make a mistake. So therefore, there is no concern. The time has not passed because you are a seller. And the Gemara continues, there was a person who had silk strips to sell. Kari shisa v'shavya chamshe. He was calling out, he wanted to sell it for 6, but it was really worth 5. Now, if somebody would offer him 5.5, have a shekel, he would take 5.5 for it. Also, a certain person came. And he said, if I give him 5.5, have a mechila. So the amount that I'm overpaying is going to be less than 1/6. So it's really going to be mechila. The sale is going to go through. So therefore, etin leishisa, it's better that I overpay by more. I'll give him 6, and therefore it's now ona ve'etvei ledin. And then I'll be able to take him to court and get back what I overpaid. And so the Gemara continues. Asa lakame de Ravi came before Rava. Amar Lei said to him, Lo shanu ela belokeach min hatagar. This halacha is only true if you buy from a merchant. Avol belokeach mi balabayis. But if you buy something from a balabayis, as in this case, so ein lo alav ona, there is no halacha of ona when you buy from a balabayis. We'll explain that in a moment. And so therefore, the fact that you overpaid by 1/6, it still is not ona since you bought from a balabayis. And Rashi explains, Mi balabayis tachshitin uklei tashma shalo chaviv olive. It means to say that the ornaments and the vessels that a balabayis uses are beloved to him. Ve'eno mochern el b'yoker. It's understood that a balabayis is only going to sell them at a high price. V'havalei kemefarish. It's almost as if he explained, Yodea anisha yesh bo'ana, that I realize I'm overpaying. De'amrina lekamon ein lo olav ono. We say that in such a case, there is no claim of ono if it's clear that you're overpaying. Kach matzasi b'sheiltos d'Rav Achoy. That's what I found in the sheiltos, and so therefore that's why in this situation there is no claim of ona, even though he paid the ona amount. And the Gemara continues, Hahu Gavra, the Havanakid Kipil Izvuni, there was a person who had jewelry to sell. Kari Shisin, he was calling out, he wanted to sell it for 60. Vishavi Chamshin, it was really worth 50. Vihava Yahavile Chamshin Vachamishin, if they would give him 55, have a shekel, he would accept that. Also, Hahu Gavra, a certain person came, V'yamr, he said, Yahivnale Chamshin Vachamshin, if I give him 55, have a mechila. Again, the amount I'm overpaying is less than ona, it's going to be a mechila and the sale is going to go through. So instead, Etanle Shisin, I'm going to give him 60, Ve'etve Ledina, then I'll be able to take him to court and get back what I overpaid. Also, Lakami de Rav Chisda came before Rav Chisda. Amarle said to him, Lo shanu ela belokech min atagar. It's only true if you're buying from a merchant. Again, avol belokech min balabayis. But if you buy from a balabayis, ein lo olav ona. Again, there is no claim of ona. Here he's buying from a balabayis, and therefore this method is not going to be effective. And the Gemara continues. Amarle Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi said to him, Yisher, that ruling is correct. V'chein amar Rebbe Elazar, and similarly Rebbe Elazar says, Yisher, that ruling is correct. But the Gemara continues. V'anon tanan kashem shona lehedyot kach ono letagar. But then we learn in the Mishnah, just like there's an onah for a regular person, there's also onah for a merchant. So what does that mean, a regular person? Man hedyot, what does it mean, a regular person? Lav balabais doesn't mean a balabais. That goes against what we just said. That seems to be saying that by a balabais there is a concept of onah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says to that, when do we say that there's onah by a balabayis? That's just bitzadaraisa. That's just when he's selling simple linen garments. Aval monitash mishte, but if he's selling the vessels which he uses, the yakire elo, those are precious to him, lo mezavin lehu ilav b'dmei yiseri. That he's not going to sell unless it's for a lot of money. And so for those items by a balabayis, again, there is no onah. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Echad halokeach v'echad hamocher yesh lehen onah. Both the buyer and the seller can have onah. The buyer if he pays too much, the seller if he sells it for too little. Kashem shonah lehedyot kach onah letagar. Just like there is onah for a regular person, so too there is onah for a merchant. For Rabbi Yehuda Omer, but Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein onah letagar, there is no onah for the merchant. Mishahutal olav yado al halyona. The person who the onah is against, he has the upper hand. Ratza omer lo tainli ma'osai. If he wants, he could say, give me my money. O tainli ma'ashani sani. Or he could say, give me whatever the onah was. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein onah letagar lekamim mefarish. Will explain Rabbi Yehuda why there's no onah for the merchant. Mishahutal olav, meaning misha nesana, the person who the onah was against. And again, you can say, tainli ma'osai, give me my money. Obviously, says Rashi, im nesana lokech. That's an example if the buyer was the one that the onah was against. So then he says, give me my money back. Obviously, if it was the seller, then he's going to want the item back. And the Gemara says, Menohani Mili, from where do we know this? How do we know there's a concept of onah both by the lokeach and the mocher? The Tana Rabbanan, as the rabbis taught, V'chisimkru memkar lamisech al tonu, it says that if you sell something, you shouldn't exploit the buyer. So ainli elisha nisana lokeach. I only know that's a warning against the seller not to exploit the buyer. Nisana mocher minayin. How do we know there is the concept of exploiting the seller, that there's a warning against the buyer not to exploit the seller? Talmud lomar okana al tonu. It says if you're buying, you should not exploit. V'yitzrich lemichtav lokeach, v'yitzrich lemichtav mocher. The pasuk needs to write both by lokeach and by mocher. The cause of rachman mocher, if it only said by the seller, mishum de kimle bezavinte, he knows the item that he's selling. Avolokeach de lo kimle bezavinte, but the buyer who doesn't really know the product he's purchasing, emelo azri rachman below sonu. Maybe there is no warning against the buyer about not exploiting the seller. The cause of rachman lokeach, if it only had the lokeach, mishum de kakani, because he's the one that's acquiring an item. The amrinchi, because people say zavnis kanisa, that the person who is buying, that person has really acquired. Avol mocher de avude come ovid, but the seller who's losing the item, the amrinchi, because people say zavin ovid, that the person who sells actually loses out. In general, a person who sells an item is losing the item. That is considered to be more of the side of the loss than the buyer. So emelo azri rachmana below sonu, I might say that the Torah does not warn the seller not to exploit, and so tzricha, that's why both are necessary. And Rashi explains, Zavant Kanis means the same. Lakachta chayfetz hamiskayim, if you buy something that will last, scharhu etzlacha, that's already considered like a profit by you. Shelo etzesa hamos biyatzi, you didn't like spend and lose the money. Varehu miskayim lach, it's almost like an investment for you. But Zavin Ovid, the person who's selling, he actually loses out. Macharta chayfetz shelcha, when you sell your object, harei ato nifsad, you're losing. Sheyichlu hamos biyatzi, you're essentially going to lose that money when you spend the money, so you're losing a certain amount of permanence, and that's why it's the buyer who's said to have the advantage in terms of a transaction. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein ono l'tagar. Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah, there is no ona for a merchant. The Gemara says, Mishum shu tagar ein lo ona, just because he's a merchant, there's no ona. The Gemara explains, Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav. Rav Nachman says that Rav says, Betagar safsar shana. We're talking about a tagar who is like a trader. He's buying and selling right away. There's not much time. There's not much of a time difference between when he buys the item and then he sells the item. And my time, and what's the reason there's no ona? Meida yoda zevinte kamashavi. He knows exactly what the item is worth. He just bought the item and now he's selling it. He's really just being mochel. The reason why I sold it for this price, mishum disram yilei zevinta achris, because he found some other deal that he was able to do. And now he's trying to retract, but he's not allowed to claim ona. Again, the tagar is not allowed to claim that he's exploited. Rav Ashi says a totally different answer. What does it mean that a merchant doesn't have ona? It means eino b'toras ona. It means he doesn't follow the standard laws of ona. Shafilu pachos michdei ona means to say that even if he was exploited at less than what's considered the amount of ona, he was exploited just a small, tiny amount. Choser, he's able to go back on the deal. And the Gemara says, Tanya Kavasi de Rav Nachman, we have a brisa that supports Rav Nachman. Rabbi Yehuda says, Tagar ein lo ona, a Tagar does not have ona, mipnei shu baki, because he's an expert. That has the idea that he doesn't have a claim of ona at all. That is not like what Rav Ashi says. Again, Rav Ashi says that not only does he have a claim of ona, he has a claim of ona, it's like an unlimited claim, even if it's just a tiny bit of ona. And Rashi explains, Shafilu pachos michdei ona choser, again, according to Rav Ashi, even if it's less than the general shear of ona, of exploitation, the tagar is able to go back on the deal. Im nisan, if there was ona, why? Dechayev teluyin b'kach, because this is his business. His whole livelihood is dependent on this. V'tiknu lo shiachzer, that's why they have a special takana on his behalf that he's allowed to go back on the deal. But then the Gemara said, Tanya Kavasi de Rav Nachman, we have a brisa that supports Rav Nachman, meaning not Rav Ashi. The afilu b'chdei ona eino choser bo, that even if there is actual ona, he's not able to go back on the deal. Ve'ein machzirin lo ona, we will not return the ona to him. Midetali time amneshu baki could go in safser, because it's clear from the brisa. It says because he's an expert, it seems we're talking about a safser, somebody who really is well aware of the price, and therefore he has no claim of ona'ah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Mishahutal olav yado al yona v'chulu. Whoever was exploited, he has the upper hand. He can either say he wants to reverse the whole transaction, or he can say he wants the ona amount. And the Gemara says, Moni masnisan. Who's the author of our Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Nassan v'lo Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It doesn't seem to be Rabbi Nassan, and it does not seem to be Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Because if it's Rabbi Nassan, masnisan katani ratza. Our Mishnah says that he has the upper hand. He can do whatever he wants. Ubraisa lo katani ratza. But in the brisa with Rabbi Nassan, it doesn't say. Rabbi Nassan doesn't say that he has the upper hand, yado al yona, that he has a choice to do either one, that he has a choice either to get back the ona or to reverse the entire transaction. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, now if you're going to say it's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, masnisan katani lokeach, the Mishnah, that talks about the buyer having the upper hand, but brisa katani mocher, but Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the brisa, he mentions the mocher. And we'll take a look at the previous Amud for a moment. That's where this brisa is mentioned. It said Tanya Kavase de Rava. Again, on the previous Amud, it said we have a brisa like Rava, ona pachos mishasus niknem mekach. If you have an ona that's less than 1/6, so then the sale goes through. Then it says yeser al shasus batal mekach shasus kano machzer ona. If it's more than a 6, it's reversed, and if it's exactly a 6, which is what we're talking about, if it's exactly ona, so then we say that the sale, the transaction goes through, but the ona part has to be returned. Divrei Rabbi Nassan, that's Rabbi Nassan's opinion. That's why we see Rabbi Nassan does not say rotza. He doesn't say you have two options, either to reverse the whole deal or get the ona. The only option, according to Rabbi Nassan, is to get the ona. And then we have Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says yad mocher al halyoni. He mentions specifically the seller, not the buyer like our Mishnah. The mocher has the upper hand. Rotza omer lo ten li mechi. If he wants, he can say here's the rotz. If he wants, he can say give me my item. O ten li mashani sani, or give me the amount of the ona. And so the Gemara answers to the question. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, "Ona zu, this ona in our Mishnah, where it says the buyer has the upper hand, he can demand either or. Eini odeh mishana. I don't know who the author is in our Mishnah, because again, it doesn't seem to be Rabbi Nassan, and it doesn't seem to be Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And the Gemara continues with another answer. Rabba Amar Rabba says, Liolam Rabbi Nassan. Actually, it is Rabbi Nassan. V'tani nami bebraisa rotza, and Rabbi Nassan would say in the braisa, he actually would say rotza. He would say that the buyer has the option. The buyer essentially has yado al holiona. Rava Amar Rava says Liolam Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Really, the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And even though Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi mentioned a seller, umay deshayir b'masnisin kamafarish bebraisa, the case that was left out of the Mishnah is talking about the buyer. So in the braisa, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi gives the case of the seller. What was left out of the Mishnah, he puts into the braisa. And the Gemara says to this answer of Rava, Amar Ravashi says Deikonami. We can even give a proof like this from the language of the Mishnah. Dekatani echad halokeach v'echad hamocher. Because what does it say in the Mishnah? It talks about both the buyer and the seller, umefarish leila lokech, and then it goes on to give you a specification, a specific case by the buyer. Shma mino, you see from this that shiure shayre lamocher, that we're just leaving out the mocher. Shma mino, and the Gemara says, indeed, you see that's the case. In other words, what is true by the lokeach is true by the mocher as well. We just didn't give all the scenarios. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoroim, Ha'omer L'chaver, if a person says to his friend, Al Menas She'en L'chalai Ona, we're doing this transaction on condition that you don't have upon me any claim of Ona. Rav Amar Yesh Lo Alav Ona. Rav says that he does have a claim of Ona, you can't make such a condition. U'Shmuel Amar Ein Lo Alav Ona. And Shmuel says there is no claim of Ona, this condition is good. And the Gemara says, Lema Rav Di Amar Rabbi Meir, U'Shmuel Di Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Let us say that Rav holds like Rabbi Meir in the following brisa, and Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yehuda in the following brisa. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Homer Leish, if a person says to a woman, Hareyan Mekudeshes Li, you are Mekudeshes to me, he is marrying this woman, he's betrothing the woman. Al Menas She'en Lachalai She'er Ksus V'Yona. He says that's on the condition that you don't have any claim of She'er Ksus V'Yona. I don't have to give you food, clothing, and Ona is the obligations of marital relations. Harezu Mekudeshes. So says Rabbi Meir, this is a good kiddushin, utano batal, but the Tanai, the condition, is actually nullified. The Tanai is nothing, and that seems consistent with Rav. Rav says you can't make a condition on a transaction that there's no Ona, and so too, again, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you can't make a condition on a kiddushin that you don't have these obligations. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's not true. But davar shebemamon, all the monetary obligations to no kayim, that is a good Tanai. You could make such a condition. Ona also is a monetary obligation, and Shmuel said you can make that condition by Ona. So Shmuel seems to be like Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara says, Amar lach Rav, Rav will say to you, Ano diamri afilo Rabbi Yehuda. I could go even like Rabbi Yehuda. Arkan lo kam Rabbi Yehuda hasam. Rabbi Yehuda only said over there that the condition is good, Ela diyada v'kamachel, because she knows exactly what she's getting into, and she's forgiving these obligations. And Rashi explains, Lema Rav Diamar Rabbi Meir. Let's say Rav says like Rabbi Meir, Damar Masnal Mashakasa b'Torah, to no batal. Again, Rav says like Rabbi Meir that if you make a condition against the Torah, so the condition is nullified. Afilu b'davar shabemamon, even if it's a monetary issue, the condition is no good. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'davar shabemamon. Rabbi Yehuda says by the case of kiddushin, by the monetary obligations, so those conditions actually are good. Could go and share uksus. For example, the food and the clothing; those are monetary obligations. Nitan lemechila, so it's possible for her to forgive those obligations. So she forgives it. Aval ona, but when it comes to the marital obligations, the marital relations, shitzar haguf, that's already a pain of the body. Lo nitan lemechila, that's not something that can be forgiven. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis.